Good morning. We continue our journey in the conclusion and review of the conclusion of Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1419, the bottom of the page. So an overall review of just the last section, and then I'll put a little in broader context, and that is that we're learning about the process of creation. And we can use ourselves as an example because we were created in the divine image. And furthermore, the whole process of how human beings and nature itself works is reflective of the way God works. And that's exactly what God intended with creating this system. If our whole system didn't make sense or just was there but we didn't understand it, then you can't use it as a platform, so to speak, a template for which to understand the cosmic process of creation. But the fact is, like we've been talking about, it's not just communication. The essence of human relationships is all about expressing ourselves, that we're not just isolated and separate entities, but we can communicate with each other. And we can express our feelings and our thoughts, which is, again, the essence of our relationships, essence of education, of parenting, of the love, of every interaction. So as we went through on pages 1417 through 1418, the step-by-step process, starting from the words of speech and the letters of speech, with letters being oisius in Hebrew, asa, being the channels of expression. So he began with dibur, even though in the parentheses he did talk about maisa, written letters, but you see that was as a parenthesis because the main thing is dibur, because that's in the nimshal when we talk about God, the dvar shamayim nasu, by Hashem, dibur and maisa are essentially the same. By us, there's a difference, obviously, as we learned. So there's dibur. Then beyond that is machshava, thought, which are also form of expression to yourself. So instead of your faculties and your inner resources can remain detached even from you, if you're not conscious of it. So consciousness itself is dependent on a flow from the superconscious to the conscious, which essentially is thought, like he said, from Helam to Gilui. Then the thought itself, he explained 2 levels in Bina, outer knowledge, what he called Chesenius HaSeichel, where there you sense more the letters, you sense the channels, you sense the definitions of the idea. And there's Pnimius HaSeichel, where it's there, but you don't sense it because you're so absorbed. And further beyond that, Chochmah, where there the Kalim haven't yet really shaped yet. So they're called Ein Nikorim, not just Ein Nirgoshim, Ein Nikorim. They're not discernible. And from there he went into the Keiches Nalamim, what he called the hidden Keiches, sometimes referred to as the Keiches Makifim, which is Rotzen and Tainug. And there too, there's an outer Rotzen, an inner Rotzen, and Tainug. And as we could move on there, the letters are not even a Metzias, I call them. They're not a Metzias yet. But in that itself, there are also levels of non-Metzias. Non-Metzias can be there's something, but it's not yet a full Metzias. And then there's non-Metzias of the Rotzen Pnimis HaRotzen. And then Tainug, which is really inner contentment, Aliyah v'amshacha, rather than an extension like Rotzen, there he said, Ein Metzias klal l'klal, I think with the words that he used. Just looking at the actual language. Einig b'chinas Aliyah v'helam, built in the Korin klal. Okay. And then finally, Eisis hakfuim b'nefesh. Now we're talking about the channels of expression that are embedded in the nefesh. And I was using the way of explaining it, the power of expression, the very power to express. So it's not yet expressed. That's why there's no letters altogether there. However, they originate there. Because the power to express yourself comes from where? As he makes the whole case, it has to come from the same place where the faculties themselves come from, which is the Etzem HaNefesh. I actually was looking up on Shabbos a little more of the sources around this, and in Samach Vav, where this idea is discussed, and he refers to Samach Vav, he actually says exactly that. He says the koyach hagili, that in the Etzem HaNefesh is a koyach hagili, but it's a koyach. It's not yet a gili, meaning it's not yet an osius of expression, letters of forms of expression. Like tainug is at the end of the day, it's some form of expression. Fine, it's inner contentment. It's not defined in the regular parameters. And the same with the levels lower beyond it, lower than it. But he called it the koyach, the power to express. And that covers the way it is in our system. And that's a dugma mezeh yuvan lamaylo. With that, we can now go back and say, okay, so how did God decide to create existence? He used the same similar process. Obviously, the major qualification that everything by us is different than it is by God, but there's much to be learned, as the Alter Rebbe in Tanya, in a number of places, mentions this, that Dibra Torah b'lashon b'nei Adam, the Torah speaks in our language, the human being from our flesh, mipsari echza laka, we can understand, while we also say, loy machshavei chem, loy dibur chem, loy diburei ki dibur chem, ki dibureinu. In other words, his thought is not like our thought. His speech is not like our speech. So we make that qualification, and it's part of the process as well. So again, I was looking up in Tanya where this is discussed both in chapters 21, 22, 21 primarily, and also in Shai Yuchid V'Amunah, if you want to look it up, the last two chapters, 11 and 12. And the Ger Sakeh, there's Siman Hey, the one we referred to, Vayaz David Sham, where he talks about all this. But especially in Shai Yuchid V'Amunah and a few other places that I mentioned, the Alter Rebbe actually talks about these two sides of it. On one hand, there's similarities and we can learn from it, and that's why God calls B'dvar Hashem Shamayim Nasu. He doesn't just say he created heaven, he says B'dvar Hashem, the Dibur, the word of God. Vayemer Elikim, Asara Mamoris Nivra Elam. So from there, so we can then now extrapolate from the way we understand as it is in our system. So he goes through, not at length, but also all these levels, starts with Dibur, then Esis HaMachshava, in Lamaila that's Malchus or Chesenius Malchus and Bina, which is Gili and Helam. Malchus, of course, Dibur is Gili, Machshava is Helam because it's to himself. And therefore they create two different type of realities. One is the revealed worlds created through Dibur, and which is revealed as of to another. And Machshava creates the hidden worlds, Alma Diskasya. Higher than that, he goes to Chochmah. Bina has already Kalim. Chochmah doesn't have Kalim yet, so Bina is the beginning of Ishtalshlus, even though Kulam b'Chochmah Sisa, everything comes Chochmah, but Chochmah is informing Bina how to create, because Chochmah is still somewhat removed. He called it a Mokir Rachik. It's a Mokir, but it's a Mokir Rachik. Chayuhi. That's Chochmah. Okay, and then he went further into Keser, which corresponds to the Ratzon and Tainug in human faculties. The Keches Nalamim, they're higher than Asis and Kelim of Ishtalshlus, and yet there's still a form of expression. Chetzenius Keser and Pnimius Keser. He doesn't mention Arechanatik, but it's essentially those two levels. And he says that he gives the example of how the letters here, the form, the flow, the channels of expression different. The example between written letters, meaning ink on paper or parchment, and engraved letters that are from within the very substance of the oil itself, of the stone in the mushal. And that is so it's not a dover nesif, even though there are clearly letters there, but it's not an additional element. So it's much more merges and it's much more integrated together with the oil, whereas the letters of expression in Ishtalshla, starting from Chachma, but especially Bina and on, are like letters, written letters. They're already taking on their own, a life of their own. Okay, that was Keser, and that's why they're Elamis and Kesel, Eisapella, the 13,000 worlds. Chesenis HaKeser. But Primis HaKeser, you can't even call it a mocker, but it's still, there's still something there. And then he goes further, Eir HaKol Batzmusei. There's Eisius, Lamaila, and Eir HaKol Batzmusei. We see from the Zohar that says, Bereshim Nisa de Malka, in the beginning when God chose Oliver Tzene, as he puts it, arose in his desire to create, Golav Galifu, he engraved letters in Tehirei Elah, the level of Tehirei Elah, which refers to many levels, but it also refers to, as Chassidus explains, the Eisis before the Tzimtzum. Now, obviously, with the big qualification, it's not letters at all. It's the concept of letters, as we put it, or the concept of the concept, depending how far you go. And he said that is the Kol B'Fleiva Tzimtzum. This is Achalei Nivra Elo. Hayahu Shmoi Bilvad. What's Shmoi? As we discussed earlier, Shmoi is made up of letters. That's what a name means. But we'll soon see that there are levels in Shmoi. And this is called Shmoi HaGadol. The same words he used, now he calls it in the in the Eir. Doesn't say in Batzmuse itself, in the Eir Nichel Batzmuse Lifnei Tzimtzum. And these two are called engraved letters. So what distinguishes between these engraved letters and the ones in Keser? So he said this is like engraved through and through. So it doesn't even have an achiza in the stone. The letters that are in the stone that are not through and through, they're actually a part of the stone, and you actually took away a piece of the stone because of it. But more than that, it's part of it, and it even darkens that area. And that's the Eisis Achkika Yesh Lem Achiza Be'ez Davar and Mashchirim. The Eisis Shebeluches, the letters that were engraved in the tablets that Moshe brought down from Har Sinai, from Hashem, there's no achiza, and they were therefore not called a metzias. And in truth, they were standing there in the form of a miracle, as the Gemara tells us, especially the letters Mem and Samach. And he also says in Samach Vav here, this is the Maimer Ein Eimdim and Samach Vav, where he discusses length. And this is an example for Ein Ein Sof, the Asis of Ein Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, that are not a metzias at all. So why do we call them Moisius? Because they are the root of where the letters will come from ultimately, like the 10 hidden spheres that are not actual spheres, but it's this concept, it's the God envisioning it, like he says a little later, Shir Asme B'Koyach, he's envisioning and allocating within the Erein Sof itself before the Tzimtzum. Then he says that this too breaks down into two levels, Aleis HaRatzon, which we just described, and there's Kaidem Aleis HaRatzon, which precedes even him choosing to want. And he compares this to Dibur and Machshava, Dibur Beinei Lebein Atzmei, as one would speak to himself, and Machshava, all Lifnei Tzimtzum, as he brings from the Likutei Torah in the drush that he calls Tzimtzum Reshimu. The drush Lahavan Inyan Mashakasa Beitzes Chaim in the Likutei Torah. Okay. And that's where we stopped. So even though you can't say Asius, but nevertheless, once you say Ola b'machshava, so he's desiring, he's already envisioning so-called existence. So in a very subtle way, that's called Asius. Similar to what we spoke about Asius in Etzem HaNefesh, the power to create Asius, as I explained. Now, just for a little broader context, all this is coming to explain the expression that he said, Hamayrych be'echad, when a person extends, saying echad, Mayrichen le'yom v'shnesav, it extends their days and years. And he said that is the meaning when we say Chol ha'imish amin yesh shmei rabba, and soon we'll see shmei rabba, shmei hagadol. You say amin yesh shmei rabba, shmei hagadol, and that is the Mayrych be'echad, that when you contemplate on the Achdus Hashem all the way to the highest levels, that's when you have the power also to eliminate Gzar Din, the Din, if you remember, to transform Gvura to Chesed. Because you're reaching Atik, and even furthermore, before the Tzimtzum in the highest levels. Now, all this is through the Avodah of a person. Because the way God created existence, you have the gradations, and you don't have this ability. Like he said, Koyach Maisav Higad La'ameh is also 28, Koyach, twice 14, the 14 joints of the hands, the two hands, but that's creation. Here we want to go deeper than creation. Creation, there's chesed, there's gvura, there's right, there's left. You want to reach deeper, there you need avodas Hashem. You need avodas neshama. The neshama comes down below. And because a neshama is rooted in these higher levels, when it does the Aveda below, it can access these highest levels and in turn transform this world into a dir b'tachtenim and transform even the negative into positive, even the gvura into chesed. So that's the broader context. As we're going to learn later, some of it we'll learn, some of it we're going to have to explain ourselves because the Rebbe Rashab doesn't finish Ayin Beis. As we're going to learn, and we have learned, the neshama using first Torah Eir and mitzvahs and the siyua of the malachim. All this we're going to learn as well. All that, the neshama down below through its aveda, because it's rooted in these highest levels, that's why it can draw from there. But it needs Torah like an outside light to illuminate because the eye cannot see on its own in the dark. So that's the connection here. Because ultimately, who is saying Amen Yeshmei Rabbah? And who is Ma'irich Be'echad? Not happening on its own. That's an Aveda. That requires a neshama in a body, a soul in a body in this world, which is a world of fragmentation, where you have all of existence with all its multitudes. And you need the contemplation to connect all of existence to the letters that God used to create existence. And in turn, those letters connect to the thought, and all the way back to Bina and Chochmah, and all the way Kesed, and all the way before the Tzimtzum. And so the neshama is doing that, and with the power of its root and source, illuminated by Torah that empowers it, the neshama is able to access these highest levels. That's the general thrust of it. Later we'll learn, when we go back to the Maimer HaMakbil L'Sheves, that neshama, when it does that, it contemplates on Shema, on Hashem Echad, which includes Ma'irich Be'echad, it in turn impacts also the animal soul. That it should also love God. V'haftas Hashem l'kecha b'chol avavcha b'shnei yitzarecha. So you see, it's not just that the neshama is accessing these levels, it actually impacts even the animal soul, turning it into fuel. Neir Hashem nishmas adam to neir, the fuel that fuels the flame, the fiery love and of Torah of Eir, all the way to the level of Torah Eir. Again, all this will come together as we learn it. I'm just giving the context of all the pieces, putting them all together here. So you see, all this is building up, going back from page 1350, where he began to speak about the interface, Mamayla Lamata, Torah Eir, how Torah empowers us to integrate an interface between divine and existence. So right now we're learning about that process of interfacing. This specific area that we're learning now is the actual process of what the contemplation consists of how, in a world like ours, we connect it so-called to the program code, like I've said, all the way to the zeros and ones. But as I said with a program, you don't begin with zeros. After zeros and ones, you have many layers of programs. You have different languages that ultimately become the final product is the screen that you use in a computer. You're typing a letter A or B. It's not an A or B. It's triggering all the programs behind it all the way back to the zeros and ones, which would be an analogy of what we're doing in this world, that when we begin to contemplate on existence, we come to realize that water and fire originate from the words of Hashem, or Eir, Rakia, and all everything in existence originates from these letters. We call it the program, the cosmic program code, if you wish. And then you travel inward into the letters of thought and all the way to the letters of Bina, Chochmah, and all the way to the highest levels, to the essential zeros and ones, and even to the conceptual zeros and ones before the Tzimtzum, as we're learning now. So that's the actual process of what a neshama does when we contemplate. And this is going to be spelled out. I'm saying it right now just to give the full narrative here. But we're going to learn all this inside. And that, of course, complements everything that was said over 500-600 pages before that about the interface Mamata L'mayla, primarily through Tefillah, where we arrive at this from the bottom up. Now, you could say this also has an element of Mamata L'mayla that we're learning, because we're starting from existence and we're moving to the divine letters that create existence. But it is the Mat L'mayla within Mamayla L'mata, though it's Tefillah. But it is with the power of Torah, because a neshama down below needs Torah to direct and guide it, the guiding light, and Torah together with the Einei Ha'eda, which I should have mentioned, the leaders that are like the Einei Ha'eda, the eyes that guide us to be able to achieve this process. So it's a combination of mamat lamayla, mamay lamata, however you twist it. The question is really what the emphasis where you begin completely from the bottom up or from the top down. Bottom up can really be from distress, like tshuva, where we're literally coming from the negative, or it could be coming through Torah, through like a regular Aveda, but you still need to always have Aveda mamat lamayla. Even when you learn Torah, you still have to learn Torah. That's an effort, the human effort, but you're learning something that's being given to us from the top down. So that's a short synopsis of what we're learning in the context of the general Ayin Beis. And if you go even earlier, interface, the first volume, the first volume and a half, or volume and a quarter, I would say, of Ayin Beis lays out firstly which we're really referring to quite a few times here, Mamala Kalam, Seviv Kalam, and the Keiches Primim, the Keiches Makifim, as they are also Lamaila, the spheres, the Sefiros, and then Keser, which is both the Eir HaGvul and the Eir HaBli, and ultimately the goal is to merge the two, which is the interface between divine and existence, or the divine that's beyond existence with the divine within existence, Seviv and Mamala, as we've been learning, the Hu and the Ata, and how do you combine them through the Tov Mekulan, the third level, Atzmus, which is higher than Mamala and Seviv. That ultimately is invoked by neshamas because they have the capacity to reach that place that can join together both levels, which will later be called Yichud Tata, so later be called Yichud Tata. Excuse me a second, let me finish. Yichud Tata, Yichud Elah, and the joining of those two unions, as we learn later, especially as Ayin Beis comes to its conclusion, the text that we have. So everything I said here is based on what we've learned and what we will learn, also based on the Maimorim that we're using here as a siyua, if I can use that word, namely Mika Hashem Elokeinu HaMagbi Chanukah Maimer, the Torah Eir, its explanation, the Mittler Rebbe's explanation of that at length, also the Maimer Einenu Me'iris from the Mittler Rebbe, and based on the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, and also the Maimer Yoseva Venhu, which is also very much connected to this. The Yoseva Venhu, as I mentioned earlier, is a Maimer from the Alter Rebbe, the Tovkuf Samach Zayin. That also is our basis, especially in the area about the pupil of the eye, the malachim and the neshamas. So that's where we are now, bottom of page 1419, somewhat of a summary. If anybody wants to ask anything, please do, and then we'll continue.
Is the Einei Ho'egel part of the Torah, or this is a separate thing?
Einei Eid are the leaders. Like he said, there's Ayin Skenim. The Skenim received the Avatzalti min haruach asher alecha from Moshe, who's like the Mufla Sheba Sanhedrin, if you recall, like Atik. He's mamshich into the Einei Ha'eda, which is like he called Meichen Sheba Midis. That's why it's 70, 7 times 10. And they, using Torah, guide us.
Is Atzmus the same as beyond?
Rebbe is a different category.
One at a time. Who's speaking?
I'm sorry, I'm still in the same question. The Rebbe is not included in the Einei Ho'ed, right? This is
if Moshe Rabbeinu
like
is the Rebbe, if is Moshe Rabbeinu the Rebbe in this case?
About Moshe Rabbeinu.
Did you hear what I said? Is Moshe Rabbeinu a Rebbe?
Yeah.
So I just mentioned him, Mufla Sheba Sanhedrin. He's part of Sanhedrin, but he's the Mufla, the Pella of Sanhedrin, which is like Atik, as he explained, Vatsalti min haruach. So he refers to Moshe Rabbeinu here. He talks about Moshe. But then Vatsalti min haruach to the Shivim Skenim. So Einei Ha'eda includes them all. I would say Rebbe is also Einei Ha'eda. He's just the leader of the Einei Ha'eda.
We're talking Neshama B'Shosho is higher than Torah.
It's not. The Ayin Beis is not. I told you, Ayin Beis spoke about Moshe Rabbeinu, and if a Rebbe is the level of Moshe Rabbeinu, we have the level that he described. You want to talk about other places, what it says about a Rebbe? It's not what he's discussing here per se. I think Moshe Rabbeinu is a good example here because Moshe is Mufla. So let's go back to this section we talked about Mufla Sheba Sanhedrin. There's a whole section about Moshe in contrast to the Skenim. Called it the level of Atik, if you recall. Yeah. You could ask a better question. If all neshamas are rooted in Yechelas Atzmus, in Shemo Atzmi and Helam Atzmi in these highest levels, so what's the role of a Rebbe in the case of that? So you could ask that question. But remember, just like Torah,
Sure.
all neshamas says they come down below, need Torah to illuminate them, their path, as well as, and they need the Einei Eda, so it makes sense. So even though Kol Eda Gedeshim Heim, as Kairach said, the whole Eda is Gedeshim Heim, and here we're saying that the neshamas are all rooted there, still a Rebbe adds, firstly reveals that in every neshama, and there's more to say on that. I don't want to go into that right now. It'll be too much tangential. Yeah. Okay. Robin, yes, you were asking something?
Thank you, Rabbi. I just wondered when you talked about Atzmus, is that the beyond the Yehuda Ilah and Yehuda Tata? Would that be parallel to that?
It would be beyond the two, and it unites the two.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yehuda Tata, Yehuda Ilah, it doesn't use that language yet here. Is more like Mamala Kalam and a Seviv Kalam, but he does use three levels here. He said Mamala Seviv and Atzmus on page. It's a very critical page, which I'll refer to later on page 12, 14, 11. We'll get back to that soon. Okay, good.
Yeah, I have a question.
Ready to continue? Yeah.
We've been learning here that creation is a process of ishtalshalos from makshava to the different many levels of osios down to dibor, so on. And I've been wondering for a while now, it seems like the pasuk where it says v'yipach ba'apav nishmas chaim, that the creation of the soul is from the breath rather than from osios. And I was wondering if that's a parallel track. Is that something that gives the neshama of a human being something unique to all of other creation, which is dibur, and this is coming from breath?
Yes, the answer is yes, absolutely.
So that's interesting.
So in chapter 2 in Tanya, when he brings from the Zohar that by Yipach is like blood breathing, but a deep breath. He says Vayipach is miptechi yusei and mipnimi yusei. So when you speak, you're also using your breath, but you don't have to exert yourself, so to speak. It's not coming from. It's not a deep breath. It's not like a deep inhale and then a deep exhale, so to speak. I'm using a physical example, where Vayipach is coming from a far deeper place from within you. So the dib dvar Hashem shemayim nasu asarim amoris come from so-called regular speech. But like when you really, let's say when a person yells, for example, I'm just using an example, coming from your inner kishkis, your guts. So it's coming from a far deeper place. As again, a physical example, in Ruchnius, it would mean that the neshama has a more pnimistic dimension of Hashem infusing, like into his child, like mamoyach ha'av, like he explains in chapter 2 in Tanya. But it's interesting, later in Shayachid V'Amunah, I mentioned chapter 11, chapter 12, he talks about how dibur, that dibur of creation is actually completely nullified compared to God's breath and God's essence. To check it out, if you really want more details, I would look there in Shayachid V'Amunah. But that's the answer, therefore, is yes to your question.
So with that, the corollary of that, or the consequence of that, would be that the neshama is something very unique in creation, and that's what gives it the ability to do the ultimate yichud of Sovev and Mamale, which is correct, because it's higher than all of that.
Yeah. But it needs Torah because it comes down below and it's concealed. In other words, the neshama needs something to trigger it, just like an eye needs an outside light in a dark world to be able to see. That's the main qualification that needs to be added.
Thank you.
And then, of course, the neshama accesses these highest levels. Yeah.
Did you say something about lo machshava sechem, that our thoughts are not Hashem's thoughts, but dibur is the same?
No, also the same statement the Alter Rebbe says, and our dibur is not like his dibur. Oh. And yet, there are parallels and commonalities. I said there's both sides. The Alter Rebbe makes it very clear that on one hand, they're not comparable. On the other hand, the very fact that God uses the word dibur Torah b'lashon b'nei Adam, and he uses the word machshava, tells us that there's some things that we could understand from our dibur and machshava about God's dibur and machshava. So it's a constant process of understanding the parallels, but also then qualifying and saying, and yet, here are the differences, which is a common thing with a mashal and a nimshal, where the mashal is daimel and nimshal, and then there's things that's not daimel to the nimshal.
Understood.
That also helps us, by the way. Even the things that God's speech and thought are not like is also part of our understanding our speech. You say, okay, here's our speech, similar to God speaking to another, like a gilui outside of yourself. And then you say, but in God's case, it's not really outside of him. So even deeper, even the things we negate are also coming from the mashal. That's very interesting component in all of this. So it's not like we just say, okay, the mashal is no longer used. The mashal is always a good mashal, and even the things that are different is also an extension of understanding the mashal.
Helpful.
Okay,
Thank you.
good. Yeah. So let's continue now. As I said, the next paragraph shouldn't be a new paragraph. If you read it, you see it's a direct flow from the previous and actually confuses, makes it sound like he's starting a new subject, but it's not. So we'll read it literally as flowing. So he spoke about two levels, right? Alois HaRatzon, where God is already so-called conscious. There's a state of conscious will. I don't want to use God as conscious and not conscious, because God doesn't need to be conscious or not conscious. He is what he is. But you could talk about a conscious will that has emerged, that has at least the parameters of envisioning existence, what he calls shir ba'atzmei b'koyach. Everyone learns that, always struggles how to translate that exactly. Because shir means measure, but shir could also be meshayir, to estimate. It's like an architect or a contractor that estimates and says, I estimate we're going to need 10 tons of concrete, and these are the resources we need to build a house. So obviously with God, you don't use the word estimate, because it doesn't have to estimate. So you say measure, envision, and allocate the resources, but it's
the same thing.
It's an expression.
Same thing.
No, I understand, but the word estimate is sometimes more like not exact. That's my point. That's the only point I want to make. But it's the same idea, and the expression comes from the Migdash Melech. Migdash Melech is one of the commentators on Zohar that Chassidus brings quite often, printed in a sefer called Migdash Melech on the Zohar, and it's from the Talmidim of the Arizal, very obviously very authoritative, and it's used Shir Atzmei B'Koyach. So it comes to explain this state before the Tzimtzum. It's the lowest level before the Tzimtzum itself, whereas the Shir Atzmei B'Koyach. And then there's the level Koydem Aleis HaRatzon. Like we're describing that, he compares more to Machshava in Lifnei Tzimtzum itself, that it's not revealed yet. It's not even a conscious state yet. Obviously, Machshava means the person who's thinking on this knows it, and Dibur is he speaking to himself. But the truth is here he calls it Kedem Aleis HaRatzon, and if you look, he says the word Ola b'Ritzeinei b'Machshavtei. So you ask yourself, 1 second, if it's like Machshava, you just say Ola b'Machshava is the lower level, like Dibur. So you have to say there's Machshava, and Ayin Beis in Samach Vav, he calls it Machshava and Koyach HaMachshava. So when you say the higher level, Ola b'Ritzeinei is Machshava, and Machshavtei. And Koyach HaMachshava, like again, the concept of the concept, if you wish. The potential of the potential is the higher level that he called Kedem Aleis HaRatzon, which he compares to Machshava. What he means here, Koyach HaMachshava, as in Samach Vav it's explained. So now, after saying the line before, Ve'ima yez de'ena shayach sham b'chinas esis, the last two lines in the paragraph, the way it's printed, that even though in the lower level you can't say there's actual letters, obviously, on that level, it already arose in his thought and his desire, all of his talshlus and everything that will come into being, the sheer b'atzmei, like we say, like envisioned, measured, and allocated the koyach. So that's why we call it Oisius. I'm getting the next line. In contrast, the higher level, the level above that, an Atzmus Ein Sof, which means not, it didn't all b'machshava and b'rotzen and b'machshava, harizel l'mayla b'chinas aleis haratzen. That's called higher than aleis haratzen, because aleis haratzen is already, the desire has arisen. Something has arisen. So something has manifest. Now we know it's not a something as an existence. It's not even a potential existence, because it's before the tzimtzum. But in the divine consciousness, as I pointed out many times, God is revealing that I want you to know that I'm making these levels in order for you to be able to have something to grasp. When I say you, meaning us. So God didn't need any of this. He could have had, it could just be the tzimtzum, and before the tzimtzum is just one seamless whole without any levels. So as I said, there's a letter from the Rebbe in 1949 where he's asked the question, how could you say levels before the tzimtzum? So the Rebbe gives two answers there. One is it's relative, like we're discussing now, it's relative. In before the tzimtzum itself, we talk levels simply for us to have something to speak about. Then he speaks about a deeper level, that all the levels there are all united, they're all one. All they sense is godliness. So whether God wants to have existence or it's prior to him wanting to existence, for God, it's the same thing, because there's no changes and no shifts. To see the letter, it's a very fascinating letter. I'm not going to go into it right now, but it definitely helps understand this. And I did learn the letter a few times here over the years. We actually read the letter inside and discussed it. If you want to find it, it's printed in volume 2 in Igres Kodesh, the Rebbe's letters. And it's also printed in volume, in volume 15 in Likutei Sichos in the Hesofis. Yeah. Okay. So now the Rebbe Rashab rather is going to explain this. He's going to explain that what we just learned, these two levels, and then we're going to go to a higher level in this as well, because you may recall there's a level that precedes even Kedem Alei Saratz. If you recall, he called that the Etzem Ha'ir, and he called that Yechelish Shmaya Atzmi Shei Kadem Kekadmusei. That's Lamaila even than Kedem Alei Saratzen. One example is on page 1415. So we'll get there too. The question is, are there letters there too? Here, apparently, he's saying clearly there are letters, not actual letters, the potential for letters, the power of letters, the power of expression. And he didn't explain, he just said that Shir Atzmi B'Koyach. The question is, are there letters in Kedem Alei Saratz? Not letters, we'll call it the power of letters. So we'll get to that now, as he's going to explain these two levels now. And then we're going to learn about a third level, which is the highest of all. But let's continue inside now. Va'inyan hu. So he's going to bring from the Maimer and Torah Er. Let's learn. So the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. 4 lines from the bottom of the page, 1419. The Inyan, this is like it says in the Hesofis to Torah Er. So the Sefer Torah Er, as you may know, is a Sefer of Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe. It wasn't published in his lifetime. It was published by the Tzemach Tzedek. It was a collection of all the Maimorim that the Alter Rebbe said, different Shabbosim and different periods, and they were gathered together in the order of Parshas. So it was actually delivered by the Alter Rebbe and written down by one of the Manichim. Most of them are from his brother, the Maril, Rabbi Yehuda Leib. Some are from the Mittler Rebbe, some even from the Tzemach Tzedek, some from Rav Pinchas Reizes. There were different transcribes. There was also some from Moshe, the Alter Rebbe's son, another son that wrote Maimorim. But the Maimorim and Torah Er were gathered together, printed in the Sefer Torah Er, and in that Sefer there's also his Sofis. Go to the back. After it stopped by Parsha Vayakel. Here's not the time to go into why it stopped by Vayakel. And Pekudei is the beginning of the next Sefer called the Likutei Torah. So the Likutei Torah is actually a continuation of Torah Er. And because of the censorship and the difficulties they had in publishing, they gave it a different name. There's a whole letter from the Frierdiker Rebbe about the whole history of these books. Just giving a little background. So Torah Er has a Sofis. So in the Sofis and Torah Er, in the Beard Vanina Sati, so there's a mimer called Vanina Sati. I think it's a mimer from Vayechi, if I recall correctly. So he says in the Beard there, he explains the following. Before we continue, let me just give a small preface so this shouldn't throw anyone and confuse anyone. You have to keep in mind something I've pointed out many times. being that we're not talking about tangible levels, as it is in the physical world. It's not linear. It's not like something's on the first floor or on the second floor, or in your cupboard. Is it on the shelf with the spices, or on the shelf with the cereal, or the shelf with the where everything has its location? In Ruchnius, it doesn't work that way. In Ruchnius, nothing is linear, nothing is spatial, not in time and space as we know it. It's all conceptual more. So therefore, the idea of microcosm, macrocosm comes into play. You know, in your kitchen, it doesn't come into play. You're not going to say there's a level of salt in the same on the shelf where you have the cereal. There's no reason to say that because everything has its location and that's it. The living room is not your dining room. Your dining room is not your kitchen. Now, do they complement each other? Yes, but each one has their space. And yesterday is not today, and today is not tomorrow. Past, present, and future. These are the parameters of time and space. When you're talking Ruchnius, even lower levels, let alone before the Tzimtzum, even in lower levels, Atzilus and Bria are not in two different geographical locations. They're like two dimensions within the same reality. So I remember the first time I came to understand this, I said, again, we were never told this. We had to figure it out myself. You know, so, you know, you think Atzilus, Bria, Tzir, Asiyah, thinking in spatial terms, you think of them like planets. You have the sun, and Mercury is the closest to the sun, then comes Venus, then comes Mars, and then comes Earth. And then come the other planets. Earth, Mars, rather, and then Jupiter and Saturn and so on. That's in physical space. But in spiritual space, it doesn't work that way. The best example is the example I've used often with atoms. Well, let's talk. Here's an object. Take any object. A cup of water. Water is made up of H2O, hydrogen and oxygen, which are made up of molecules, which are made up of atoms, which are made up of subatomic particles. So someone ask you, where are the subatomic particles? Are they here? And the molecules are here? And the water is here? No. The water itself is made up of all these components. It's just going deeper into them. And you understand that when you start really thinking in terms of not spatial space in this context of here and there. In the same place, you could have thousands, if not infinite levels. So when you think of it that way, so when you talk about Seder Shtalshlus, you're talking about Atzilus, Bria, Tzir, Asiyah, it's 4 dimensions. Atzilus is the Atzilus dimension, the Elokus within it, if you wish. Bria is the structure, the broad structure, the raw structure, if you wish. Tzir is the shape and form. So yes, in a physical world, they could be 4 steps, and they don't happen at the same time, but in the spiritual world, they're happening all the time. So Atzilus is active now, and Bria is active, and Yitzir is active, and Asiyah is active right now. We say in the morning, the Shamash and the Satabi, Ata Tahirahi. Then we say right away, Ata Barasa, Ata Yitzata, Ata Nefachtabi, Ata Meshamre Bekirbi. It's not 4 different locations. It's the Neshama going through these stages all the time. The question is where you're focusing on. What's manifest in your life? Is it your biological life, or is it your emotional life, or is it your intellectual life, or is it your transcendent dimension? So when we talk about the higher levels that we're discussing here before the Tzimtzum, so he's going to explain it by using 2 levels after the Tzimtzum. We're going to talk about an Ak, and though it's lower than what we're discussing before the Tzimtzum, but it's an example for something before the Tzimtzum. So you'll often, like we talked about Atik, in Ishtalshalos, so to speak, we have Atzilus, the 10 spheres of Atzilus, then we have Keser. Keser has Arich and Atik. And we talked about Atik is Hataka, and Natak v'Nivdal, it's completely removed. And then suddenly he says, and the Sheresh of Atik is Lifnei Tzimtzum in the highest place, in the Helam Atzmi, or however he explained it. So which one is it? The answer is that it's constantly like a hologram repeating itself, except on different levels. We just had this in the last paragraph. He said, Machshava and Dibur, before was Machshava and Dibur were 2 forces of God in Ishtalshalos. Dibur is Malchus, Machshava is Bina. And now he said that in the Likutei Torah, it says that Dibur Beinei Lebein Atzmei is Malchus of is Olaber Etzene, and Dibur and Machshava is Kedem Alei Saratzin. So again, it's just an example, all relative to that level. Then you say, in that level itself, this is like Dibur, this is like Machshava. But it's not Dibur and Machshava in the world of Atzilus, in Malchus and Bina, or even lower, like our Dibra Machshava. This again goes into the same discussion that there are parallels, but there are also differences. So very often Chassidus will use lower levels to explain higher levels. So don't get confused and saying, one second, which one is it? It's both. It's just this one is on a lower level, so it's easier to discuss, or it's an actual source. And based on that, the Rebbe Rashab is going to understand. Now we extrapolate and say, similarly, before the Tzimtzum, on a far, far more sublime level, we also have similar two levels. So this is very common. I thought this introduction is helpful, not just learning here, but many Maimorim. You learn this is essentially the idea that helps us understand lower levels, help us understand higher levels. And you have to always look at where he's moving from one to the next to make sure that all the qualifications are in place. Okay, so with that said, that short introduction, so he's going to bring now from the world of Adam Kadmon. Now, Adam Kadmon, Ak, is the acronym, is we know the first world created after the Tzimtzum and the Kav. So when the Kav began to shape existence, like an artist's stylus, an artist's brush, and the Kav is carrying the divine energy of creation. So the first thing it creates is, as the Eitz Chaim says, Igulim of Ak, and it creates the world of Ak. Now, Adam Kadmon is actually called a Adam Kloli. Sometimes it's called Kloli. Magid uses that expression, the Alter Rebbe said. In other words, it's like the picture within it will be all the worlds. It's like the blueprint of the whole existence. We've learned about Ak a number of times. So Ak is a very high level. Inishtalshul is the highest, much higher than Atzilus, because Atzilus is a structured world of 10 spheres. Higher than it would be Toyu, and higher than that is Akudim, 10 energies in one container. Beyond that is Ak, where you don't even say they're containers at all. You just say it's energy, or sometimes there is the reference to container, but the potential in Ishtalshus itself is considered to be the first so-called platform, the first stop. That's why we say Tseifo Mabit, we say Bachshava Gduma Da'ak, that everything that God, everything in existence until the end of time and space is all seen and gazed upon by Ak. That bigger picture we spoke before about Istaka Baraisa, when God looks into the Torah, creates the world. That's Torah in the world of Ak. So he's going to discuss now that in Torah and the Esophagus, he discusses Ak, two levels. So he says like this. So in the Bir Vanat Nisat, he says the Atzmus Ak, the core of Ak. Core means the essence of Ak. Atzmus Ak, again, the core, and then there's going to be not the core, the Hispashtus. Sometimes Atzmus is the core and Hispashtus is the extension. Sometimes Atzmus could be more the Pnimius and the core and the Chitzenius. So we'll see the language that he uses here. He says, Ubchinis Kadmus HaMaitzil. That's the term he uses, Kadmus HaMaitzil. Now, Kadmus HaMaitzil means the Kadmus is always that word I find hard to find. In Maitzil itself, Maitzil is the emanator, Natzilus. So the Netzolim are the emanations, the 10 spheres. The Maitzil is the emanator. Like we say, Nivroim and Boira. So what Nivroim are to Boira, Maitzolim are Netzolim are to the Maitzil. So Nivroim are creations. They're already created, Yesh Ma'ayin. And the Boira is the creator. Or like Yitzurim. We say in Rosh Hashanah prayers, we say, Yitzur kol Yitzurim. The Yetzer is the shaper of the things that are shaped. The producer and the product. So Maitzel and Netzolim is an expression, and in Maitzel itself, you could say that the lower dimension of the Maitzel, or you could say Kadmus HaMaitzel. Kadmus HaMaitzel means the earliest, the beginning of the Maitzel, if you wish. And also Kadmus means nothing precedes it. Like we said, Kadmin Kikadmuse, meaning he's the first. Nothing precedes. He's like the first cause, so to speak. So that's what he says, that Atzmus Ak is, that's why it's called Adam Kadmon. Adam Kadmon. What's Kadmon? The primordial man. Sometimes the word is what, but Adam Kadmon means there's an Adam that's not Kadmon. The first of all. So it's like the first template, the first structure that God creates. So he calls it Kadmus HaMaitzil. The Hainu, which means this, Ki aku b'chinas Adam harishon she'ola b'machshava be'ein sof hakadmin l'chol hakdumim. Ak, being that it's called Adam, is Adam harishon. Rishon also is kadmin. That's what Rishon means. I believe in the Targum on Bereshis, Bara Lakim, it says Bekad Misa. Bereshis is Bekad Misa, in the beginning, meaning the first. So Adam Harishon, now this human being, Ola B'machshava, arose in God's mind, where? In Ein Sof, Hakadmin L'chol Hakdumin. So though everything obviously was created by God and by Ein Sof, but the human being, as was mentioned before, has a special place. We say Yisrael Ola B'machshava, everything Ola B'machshava, but it means in machshava itself. It's like the difference. The example we've been using. You have a thought and a will to build a house. Fine, that's not kadmus ha-maitzel. That's not kadma mechol kadmenim, because the house is a means for your family to live. That would be kadmus, because that's the purpose. God created 6 days creation. Then he came in the 6th day and he created the human being. Says the Gemara, asked the Mishnah, why did he create human being as last? So one of the answers given is because first you set the table, then you bring the special guest. The crown jewel of creation is the human being. That's why in Rosh Hashanah we say, Zeh Yom Tchilas Masecha. So the question, what do you mean? Today's not the beginning of creation. Tchilas Masecha, the first day of creation, the 25th of Elul, 6 days earlier was the beginning of creation. So it says no, because that was the beginning of setting the table. The purpose of creation was the human being. So we count from when the purpose. In other words, when you start counting, when did I start living in this house, is the most important thing, not when I start building the house. Even though God wanted the house, and of course it's important to know that, but if you want to talk what's the purpose of it all, similar to what the Alter Rebbe explains by Shemitah. He asked the question in Pasha Bahar. It says, Ki savoy la'aretz, when you'll come to the land, v'shavsa ha'aretz Shabbos l'Hashem. You should rest the land, Shabbos l'Hashem, Shemitah. And then he goes on and says, Sheish shanim tizmer karmech, teish shanim tizr sadecha. 6 years you should sow your land, and you should prune your vineyard, vines. And then again he says, B'shana Shavis, in the 7th year, rest the land and don't work the land, Shemitah. So the Alter Rebbe says, so why did he begin V'shav Sa'aretz? You should have right away said, you'll come to the land, 6 years you'll work the land, and the 7th year, Shabbos. Why do you begin? So he says, because that's the kavanah. As soon as you come in, you need to know the end in mind. What's the mission of it all? You're not sowing the land, you're not planting, and you're not working the land, just work the land. You're working in order to cause that it should come to Shabbos. Like Shammai would put away, even on Sunday, a good piece of food for Shabbos. Zoche Shema Shabbos, the Ramban Paskins says, means that you remember Shabbos, not just on Shabbos, on Sunday and Monday, because the purpose of the whole week is to elevate it through Shabbos. So therefore, in that context, what's the crown jewel? The human being. That means Kadmin, Adam Harishon, not just the first person, means that it arose first. The first thing that arose in God's mind, Kavyachal, so to speak, was the human being. That's what he wants, that the human should come into this world and make a dira b'tachtenim. But in order to do that, we need to build a house. We need to build a world. We need to build a Gan Eden. So that's what he did. Day 1, day 2, day 3, all the way through day 6. The world is ready now. Now comes the purpose of it all. So essentially, the purpose and mission precedes everything. Seif Maisa, Machshavat Chila. The end is, you have in mind, in the beginning, Machshavat Chila, meaning Betchilas HaMachshava, in the earliest stages. So essentially, he's saying, Adam Kadman is referring to that. Adam is Sha'ola b'Machshava, be'Ein Sof HaKadman l'chol HaKdumim. That it arose in Ein Sof HaKadman l'chol HaKdumim, which is the first, before all firsts, meaning there are many, they could also call Keser Kadman. You can call different levels are the first, but the first of all firsts is this level, and that's why it's called Adam Kadman, Kadmus HaMaitzel. V'nemer al zeh, and the pasuk says about this, B'tzelem Elokim also, that God created the person, B'tzelem, in the divine image. Everything was created by God, but the neshama dafka, the human being, has the power of being like the image of the divine, meaning it's coming from that level, these highest levels. Shal shem zeh nikra b'shem Adam Kadman. And due to that, that's why we call it Adam Kadman. Ukameshin is boil ill. As was explained earlier, this was explained, I remember in volume 1 very explicitly, a whole section, and I think also later as well, maybe even in this volume. I'd have to look up where exactly, but he definitely explained it earlier. And so that's Adam Kadman. And also, you can see right here, goes back to our theme, that is the neshama that invokes, that is able to generate these highest levels because of this reason. So this is also probably part of why he's bringing this here. But he's still coming to explain the 2 levels before the Tzimtzum, as we'll get to. Okay, that's Atzmus Ak. But Ak is not just the Atzmus of Ak. That's the core. That's the essence of Ak. Now he's going to say Malchus of Ak. He's going to talk about the second level, what I called before either the outer dimension or the Hispashtus, the extended dimension. But I'll stop a second if anybody wants to clarify what I just explained about Adam Kadm.
Yeah, I thought that Ak was a world before Akudim and before Atzilus, and it was a world. But now we're referring to Adam Kadmon, who was created with Tzelem Elokim, which is right in the Torah, like the Adam that we know.
And there's the Adam that we know on earth that originates from Adam Kadmon in the spiritual worlds, that is all-encompassing world. Just for the record, Adam Kadmon, as I said, think of it like a big circle. Within that circle will be the whole Ishtalshalis, including Akudim, Nekudim, Vrudim, Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya. So Adam Kadmon is the overall, and everything is called the name Adam. I don't think you were in part of the class, but when I explained, there's a mimer from the Alter Rebbe, a very classic mimer called Drush Gimel Mine Adam, called the Drush of 3 types of Adam. And he talks about how all the worlds are called Adam. Like Atzilus is called Adam da Atzilus, sometimes Adam Elyon. Bria is called Adam da Bria, Adam da Yitzira, Adam da Asiya. And Ak is Adam Kadmon, because the concept of the image of God, remember, before human being, the image of God is not human. The image of God is as God manifests himself in 10 spheres. So there goes through many gradations, many levels. The first place that so manifests is Adam Kadmon. Then Adam Kadmon will then evolve and then become the Adam of the next level, and the Adam of the next level. Then there's, of course, the creation of man on earth. The actual physical human being is a reflection of a mirror image of these Adams, all the way to the highest levels. Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, so now let's talk about the second level in Ak. So the B'chinas Malchus the Ak, the Alter Rebbe says in this Maimer Torah, a beer in Torah, a beer of an Anina Sati. So turn the page, 1420. Who B'chinas Shmo Baruch. The Alter Rebbe says there it's called the name of the blessed name of Hashem. V'hainu B'chinas is Galus. So Atzmus Ak is not a state of his galus, just a state, the core, the essence. That's what he is. Now we're talking about a revelation. Lies nikra b'shem l'gabe netzolim. As soon as you say something has a name, no one needs a name for themselves. Definitely not God. So what's the meaning of a name? Why does the thing have a name? So others can call it by that name. So it's a form of revelation. Like we spoke about a few pages back, that Shem is Asius. Not Asius, nevertheless, not necessarily physical Asius or tangible, but expression. It means Shmoi. Now you have a handle. You call this thing by a name. So it's his galus l'ikab shem l'gaba netzolim. Remember, there's the maitzil, the emanator, and netzolim are the emanations. So now you have the level of Malchus of Ak, Shmoi. His galus is called by name l'gaba netzolim. So the netzolim have a name. Chochem. In other words, the name is not the name of the etzem, because the etzem doesn't need a name. L'gaba netzolim, it's a name. What is the name? Chochem. He's wise. The chazdan. He's kind. He's a kind one. These are names of you identify someone by being a wise one, chazdan, a kind one. B'chochme yediyah, in a knowable wisdom. So we have chachma v'lei chakim v'lei b'chachmi yediyah, a wisdom that's beyond us. But a name is meant to be some description. So when you say God is wise or God is kind, you're already talking about an attribute here. So this is already a gili, what he calls shmoi. I'm going to go slowly here because this is a very dense, and he's relying a lot on what we learned earlier, and that's why I'm explaining it more than I usually do. Because, I'm explaining it more detailed because the lines are very compact, and without the explanation, it's going to be hard to understand. So next line now. It's going to be a little. Don't get overwhelmed. It's going to be a little like an idea that we have learned earlier, but we haven't discussed it recently. So he's going to say it like this: V'zeu commotion is barely ill. Rebbe Rashab is now adding, to understand this, this is like what we've learned earlier. The mashenetzola b'chinas ha'chochmeh, b'chinas yediyas atzmei. That when God emanated, remember there's emanations, these are divine attributes. Obviously God is not defined by any divine attribute. Because lav inun midus iyu klal. He's not defined by any parameters. It's only after the tzimtzum and after concealment where godliness begins to be defined. So the question is why? Why did God create these definitions? So obviously the answer is for us to be able to have something to hold on to, for something to emulate, for something to live up to, something that we can direct and guide us, that just as God is chesed, we should be chesed. Just as God has chachma, which he embedded in Torah. So when we use our chachma, our wisdom, to understand God's wisdom, so we're connecting with God's mind. Obviously, God is beyond the mind and beyond chesed. So we learned earlier that the reason that these spheres were netzolim, b'chinas ha'chachma, b'chinas yediyas atzmei, because what's chachma there? There's no one else that God is teaching yet. You're talking about Adam Kadmi, you're talking about these highest levels. It means that God himself is manifesting himself, godliness, I should say, is manifesting in a concept called awareness, yediyas atzmei, that he knows, he's aware. Now, again, this doesn't mean that before that God was not aware. It means he didn't need to be aware. He is it. Everything is part of him. He doesn't need to be aware. But the very concept, you say God is aware, is only for us to understand that God is engaging with a concept called awareness. Similar to what we learned about Erdana, that God just said, let us descend and see where the cry of Zdom is coming. So Chassidus asked the question, what does that mean? Where is he descending from? Before he doesn't know. So it says before Yodua, it was known to him. He knows, like from a, I don't want to say the word distance, but in a more non-engaged way. But he wants to show, I'm with you in your pain. I know it because I've come to see you. Not the king sitting in his palace and he's aware of what's happening, actually travels and wants to see it firsthand. So obviously by God doesn't need to travel. So the mashal, Dibra Torah b'lashon b'nei Adam, the Torah speaks the language of man, so we call it Erda. That so-called the divine, instead of remaining so removed, is engaging and is now seeing it like we see it. Like Ima Enechi B'tzara, we say. I am with you in your pain, in your distress. So in that sense, so the reason there's Netzola b'chinas Chochmeh, b'chinas Yediyas Atzmei b'chdei. Why did God do that? He didn't need to do it. Because that will now serve as an interface that now from there can emanate. God saying, I am now manifesting, godliness manifesting in Chachmeh, from there will emanate the Chakim, the B'chachmi Yediyah, the intelligence of a knowable wisdom of Atzilus. Which means basically he's giving us the attribute of Atzilus, the attribute of wisdom in Atzilus. Had God not done that, then you would have had a separation. There's God where God is. Our wisdom is human wisdom, and that's it. How far can we go? We have a ceiling, because we're human beings after all. But God said, no, I will allow the divine to manifest in an attribute called Chochmah, and that Chochmah will be what's called Chochmah of Atzilus, and that will become the Chochmah that you can draw from and connect to, and through that connect to me. So when we say in the pasuk we learned earlier, remember by the Skenim, when Moshe said Ma'ayin li basar, the Jews wanted meat. So Hashem said, gather the 70 Skenim, the 70 sages, the elders, and v'atzalti min haruach shalecha aleihem. I will atzalti, I will impart from the chachma, from the ruach, the spirit upon you, into them. So Atzilus, as we learned there, is essentially imparting from Keser, from Atik, all the way from Adam Kadmon, from the higher levels, imparting it upon them. Obviously, they're a lower level, but they are getting now the spirit of Moshe. So they can serve as an interface between the higher levels that are beyond Chachma, now manifesting in a level of Chachma that we can relate to. So essentially, it's an interface between beyond the attributes to the attributes. So they are emanations, not creations. And that's a key thing, emanation, atzilus, not bria. And that is essentially what is going on. And that is the Shmoi. The Shmoi, so when we say God is Chacham, Chazdan, because in Ak, there's a level called Chesenius Ak, or called Malchus of Ak, Shmoi. So not just that there's the Atzmus of Ak, that God wants to have the human being on earth, but actually a revelation of God's divine attributes that will then become imparted and embedded in the human organism, the human structure, the human being. Okay, that's step 2. Now there's one more step here, but I'll stop again. Any questions on what we just learned? Umaklolis inya Shmoi. So now Shmoi is going to talk about 2 levels in Shmoi. From the first level we just described is just the mere fact that God is now allowing himself to be defined in some way. Not God, godliness, I should say, Shmoi. Because Shmoi is a gili, like he said. It's described. What's his name? Chochem, Chazdan. But there's the general name, and Klolis Yishoin is Havu Prote Hashemus. After establishing the general name, that God has a name, that there's an expression of the divine, not just the etzem of the divine, of Ak we're talking now. So from there emerges Nisavu, the detailed names. This is all the language from Torah. The Zayin Melochim, Shein Zayin Midas Hagnuzas B'Maitzil. Of the 7 kings, which we need to understand, why is he using the word Melochim here? Often that's used on Toyu. That I have to look up. I don't remember now in Torah why he uses it, but he says that. And these are the 7 midas, the 7 attributes that are hidden in the Maitzil, in the emanator. Now all this is Ak. Because in general, the 10 hidden spheres, according to the Kisra Arizal, is generally an Ak. The Chassidus is Machadish, that we also have them before the Tzimtzum in Shir Atzmei B'Koyach, which we'll talk about a little later. Just wanted to clarify. So now he's calling them 7 midas. Why are they gnuzes? Because Atzilus has not yet emerged. We're still talking in the core of Atzilus, in Ak. So we're talking about Atzmus of Ak, which he described already, which he described as the Atzmus of Adam Kadmon, Kadmus HaMaitzil. But now we're talking about the expression of the Maitzil, and that is the 7 midas, which correspond to the 7 names that we know, the Shiva Shemesh Ein Nimchakim. There are 7 names of God, which are Kael, Elikim, Havaya, Tzvokes, Shaddai. That's 5. What am I missing? There's 2 more. It'll come to me in a moment. Shaddai, Tzvokes, that's 5. Okay, so those are the 7 midas. Well, commotion is boyasham. As it's explained there, he means there in Torah the Alter Rebbe, the klolos inyan esespheres segnuzes, that the general inyan idea of the 10 hidden spheres, heim chinas shemus. So the different ways the 10 spheres, hidden spheres are explained. There he explains them as names. Shayidei kriya shem chachem nasa b'chinas chachma behelam. So there he comes to explain that they're not actual spheres, they're names. When you call the name, what's happening is you call someone Chacham. Doesn't mean yet he's a defined Chacham. You're calling that name, so you're drawing out that attribute of his, the Helam, in a concealed way. That's how the Alter Rebbe explains this Sefiros Hagnuzis. Sefiros Hagluyos is actually when you're performing wisdom, when you're standing as a wise person and giving counsel. And Bina is Maven, understanding. Chesed is when you're doing Chesed. But the personality, the attribute of Chachma is like a name. And when you're called by the name, you're drawing out from the core, which is beyond the name, into at least in a concealed state that you have now. You'll be called a Chacham. As he explains there, that Chacham doesn't mean even when you sleep, you're a Chacham. Doesn't mean you're activating Chacham. It just means that you have that attribute. And that's why he calls it names. So it's another example to show something is not really yet substance, but something is already defined. Because if you didn't have the attribute of Chachma, obviously you couldn't perform. You couldn't activate Chachma. So Chachma is the name that precedes the action of it, the definition that. So a person is a Chacham. Like you say, a human being is a speaking entity. Doesn't mean we're speaking all the time. It just means we have the capacity to speak. So Shemo is that what he's called there, B'Chachma B'Helam. V'heim b'chinas shemes protim b'chinas ak. These are the specific names in the level of ak. Ima yesem b'chinas gnuzas. Even though they are in a state of concealed state, shem b'tachlis ha'achdus. Even though, I should read the song differently, they are specific names, even though they're hidden, and they're completely, utterly, and seamlessly united with the source. U'kamoshin is bar le'il. And then he continues and says, so even though they're completely united and seamless with the source, but they're already called names. V'heinim shachim b'chinas Malchus the Ak, and these names are extended from Malchus of Ak, sh'deu b'chinas Shem Echad. So it begins as one name. Hu b'chinas hamshachas ha'oda b'chinas Atzmus Ak. Now he's saying that this Malchus of Ak, one name, is an extension from the reflection of the Atzmus Ak, the higher level we spoke about before. Lias inyan zeh, sha'idei kriyas Hashem is yeh b'chinas ha'helam, she'yeh b'chinas moked el ha'gilui. So they originate from Atzmus Ak, so they first begin as one, and then they become, as we call them by names, like we said, you call it the name, they now come at least in a state of concealment, which will become the source of them being activated. So in other words, like three levels here. There's the etzem, no names at all. It doesn't need a name. The very concept that there's a name means there's going to be some manifestation. Going to allow himself to be identified. So what's he identified as? Chacham, Chesed, and so on. But it's still only the capacity, the power, the concept, if you wish, the concept of Chacham, Chesed. And then from there, first from one general name, the idea of Gili. And then from there will come the concept of all these different names, which now at least have created, it's still Helam, Gnuzis, still concealed, but now you have the archetype of a Chacham and of a Chesed, from where you can now draw out that will ultimately become an actual Chachma and Chesed in Atzilus. So Ak has these two levels, the Atzmus Ak, which is beyond, the general name, and then the specific names that come from Malchus of Ak, as you call, and you're drawing it out from into a state of Helam at least. But it's not even Gilu yet. And the Gili will be when it finally manifests in the actual Netzolim, that you have the Atzilus of Chachma, Bina, Das, and so on. This is briefly what he says in Torah. You see, it's a little dense and complex, but I hope I did some justice in explaining it. And this is going to use now to understand what's going on Lifnei Tzimtzum, in even a more subtle level. But first, let's make sure we understand what we just learned here. I'll stop for any questions.
So maybe
we'll stop here, period, for this class.
All of this, when he's speaking about Ak, in all of these things, even though he mentioned Sefiros Hagnuzis, all of this is Le'achar Tzimtzum?
Of course. Yeah.
What Sefiros Hagnuzis?
I just explained the Kisra Rizal, Sefiros Hagnuzis is the world of Ak. because the Sefiros Hagluyos is Atzilus. Ak is not Atzilus. Ak is still, the Sefiros are still concealed. Chassidus, Chabad, introduces that you also can speak about Sefiros Hagluyos Lifnei Atzimtzum. But it's a Chiddush. The Rebbe has a footnote about it that I posted a few months ago from Ranat. He talks about that in Cholzer Ranat. The Rebbe has a footnote. We posted it. Maybe someone can find it.
You posted it recently, or the first time we learned it?
It's probably 2 months ago.
I'll look for it. I seem to remember a little bit.
It was just a page with two big footnotes. I posted it for a different reason, but it also included that footnote.
Okay, bli neder. This is Hashem. I'll find it. Want me to try and find it?
Yeah, if you find, just post it again. Just you don't have to do, just
forward it back. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll find it somewhere. I don't know where we'll find it. Oh, it's easy to find. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a question, and you may have explained this, but I just didn't sink in for me. So maybe a stupid question.
Oh, I just found it. I'll post it right now.
Okay.
But go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So, in general, I thought that Ak was the first level. It's where the Kav begins to enters into creating an existence. It's like the first.
The Kav is, like I said, the paintbrush.
Right.
That creates everything, and the first world will be Ak.
Ak. Right. Okay. So Ak is a revelation by definition.
Relatively speaking.
Okay.
Like a revelation, like the conception of one cell. Is that a revelation, or is the birth of the child?
If it exists, well, okay, I understand. These are all real, very subtle nuances. That's Dafka my question.
That's why I'm answering it, because I understand.
Well, I haven't even asked. You say Sefiros and Genuzos are the level of Ak, but Ak is revelation. Sefiros and Genuzos, as I understand it, are something or a kol b'atzmuso, because they're the concept of the potential for revelation.
So think of a conception. Think of one cell. It's been conceived. Would you call it revelation or hidden?
I would say that the cell is revealed, but all the other cells are not. They're concealed.
Right. So there you go.
So that's Ak, and that's just all these hidden cells, if you will.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
You have to keep in mind, this is never going to be linear. It's always going to be relative, always. And even Atzilus, let's be honest, the 10 spheres of Atzilus, from our point of view, is also not revealed. We see 10 spheres of Atzilus. Does anyone see that?
Yeah, I hear you. I understand. But it's certainly more defined. We could say that.
Yeah, that's why each of us has to work this through, because each of us is going to have a different understanding of these abstractions. You remember the discussion I talked about abstraction?
100%, yeah.
Yeah. For many of us, as I said, even 10 faculties within your soul is hard to imagine, because we've never seen faculties. We only see their expression. Like the koyach hariyah and the nefesh. What does it look like? It's a power. It's a faculty. It's a capacity, ability. But it's definitely a koyach, as opposed to how it's an etzem nefesh, and definitely as opposed to how it's an atzilus. See, so you're always going to be working with understanding how you understand it. The fact of the matter is, to be very honest, most people will understand Ak more or less what is actually more like Asiya Ruchnius. Asiya Ruchnius. Because to understand Ak, you have to first understand Asiya Ruchnius well. Then the Sira, then Bria, then Atzilus, and then higher than that, all the way. The Rebbe Rashab is laying it all out. But if
are you
really
saying,
want to,
when you say Asiya Ruchnius, you don't mean to say that in a slighted way. You mean Davka that. Correct?
Exactly that, yes.
Okay.
There's Asiya Gashmius, there's here's a...
Where we are, yeah.
Let's say you're seeing something with your eyes right now. That's Gashmius. But what is the ruchnius of vision like? Koyach hariyah. And then start going back to the world of Asiya in Elikus, the Koyach hariyah in Asiya ruchnius, and then the Yitzira, and then the Bria. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, 100%.
That's why I give the example of the molecules and the atoms and subatomic and keep going. As you go, molecules and atoms are not the same. A molecule is far more tangible than an atom, even though molecules are also not that visible. So, but oxygen and hydrogen is already an element. So, those elements are made up of particles. My point is that it needs a lot of work because most of us, abstraction goes 1, 2, 3 levels max. Here we're talking about hundreds of levels. That's why I told you there are people who daven 6 hours under a talus because they're able to go through all these levels.
Okay. May I ask a question? From it's not exactly pertaining to today's share, but it was from last week. A statement you made last week, or should I wait?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Last week you made a statement that yesh ma'ayin you said could be considered the Big Bang. The Big Bang could be considered it's Tzimtzum Rishon, whereas I've always conceived of it as the beginning of Gashmias from Malchus Sheba. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, because I was very taken aback by that statement, that the physicality would seem to be from Malchus of Asiya rather than from the Tzimtzum Rishon.
It depends what you mean by yesh ma'ayin. In Chassidus says that even in some ways, yesh ma'ayin. Yesh ma'ayin is simply a paradigm, a quantum leap from non-existence to existence. What I meant to say, relatively speaking, in modern scientific language, the Big Bang can be seen, because obviously before the Big Bang, even according to science, there was something there before, there was a yesh. I was just giving an example of a quantum leap in Gashmias itself, but not technically yesh ma'ayin. Anything outside of Atzmus is yesh ma'ayin if you really want to drive the point home. And yet there are things that are more similar to Elikus, so we call them more of a netzal, like an emanation. Even though Chachmas also you could say is yesh ma'ayin compared to Atzmus, or higher levels of Elikus. So I was just explaining it in a technical concept. I'm not placing yesh ma'ayin in the Big Bang. It was just an example of a paradigm shift.
No, because somebody who learns Chassidus, you could understand yesh ma'ayin from the different levels of Tzimtzum Rishon, or even maybe it's from Etzem or from Helamaz.
Real
But
yesh
I'm talking
ma'ayin
about
would
from
be
a science.
Real Breishis Bar Lakim is yesh ma'ayin,
Right.
Technically speaking, and that's that. The Big Bang, I don't know if it's Breishis Bar Lakim. Big Bang already, according to them, there was something before that. Then no one says before the Big Bang was ayin. It's a yesh to yesh ultimately.
Yeah.
I'm just giving an example. I didn't mean it in any literal sense.
I see. Because I would think, according to science, the Big Bang was the beginning, the ultimate, the absolute primordial first.
Yeah, but science can only begin with yesh. Science
Right.
cannot talk about an ayin because
Right.
it's not a scientific concept.
Exactly. So that yesh that they're talking about would seem to me to be stationed, so to speak, in Malchus Shabasiyas Siya Gashmi.
I don't know if I'd place it there even. Probably lower, in my opinion.
Lower? You mean
Yeah.
closer to human creation rather than
because
lower?
again, is Breishis Bar Lakim the Big Bang? I would say not. Breishis Bar Lakim creates in the reality where there can be a Big Bang. But before the Big Bang, the scientists will tell you there were ingredients that caused the Big Bang. They just can't talk about it much because they can't replicate it. But so for me, the Big Bang is already after the real Bria Yesh Ma'ayin.
Right. Okay. That's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't understand the idea of science with the Big Bang. What's the sense in it? What's the logic in it?
It makes total sense. Makes total sense that in order to create a lot of details, so on, it's like anything, so like, You put together ingredients, and those ingredients will ultimately explode and create a whole kinds of new solar systems and stuff like that. That makes sense. Why not?
Who put the ingredients?
That's not the question. You
That's
could
not
say
the
God.
question.
God.
What I'm
What's-
trying to say, Rabbi,
I
tell us that
not that recognizing.
they're
The
always
Big Bang is not
scientists
a
deal with
replacement
empirical.
of God. There are people who believe in God and fully understand the Big Bang. Big Bang is not necessarily instead of God. It's also part of how God did it. Well, the Sefiros HaKelim, some people want to compare that to the Big Bang.
But science would say, I think it's empirical. Their beginning is empirical. They only deal with empirical. That's why they don't know what happened before it, what preceded it. The empirical, I think, starts with the very first cell of material existence, whatever that would be. That would be the Big Bang, which Rabbi Taitel. That's why they deal with it. They don't deal with before the preceding the Big Bang, because that's not empirical.
Right.
Because to them,
They deal with things. We're talking here about concepts of capacities of ability to produce. There's no way to measure that, like
unless they learn Ayin Beis.
exactly. So I had a question or just a comment about earlier, Rabbi, when you were talking about, we're created in the image of Hashem, and when you were talking about the levels of thought before it actually becomes the osios. I mean, is that the way that we create things also? I mean, can we think of it in those terms? Because I'm trying to relate it to my own, experience. Would that be accurate?
Well, I said that the example that he began is our own process of creating or communicating or expressing. So answer, I mean, we be specific. What aspect? Obviously, we're not creators like God is a creator.
No, I meant inspiration. Like, where does it come from?
When we was at almost every class, I elaborated that we are created to be able to, in a way that mirrors the way God created. Answer is yes.
Thank you.
He actually laid it out on the previous 2 pages, page 14, 17 and 8, 14, 17 and 14, 18. He laid out the whole steps from action, speech, thought, bina, chachma, desire, pleasure, etzem hanefesh. You were
What
here.
page? I'm sorry.
I'm saying you were here in these classes, during these classes?
No.
Huh? Last week, we went through all these stages on these 2 pages, 14, 17 and 14, 18.
Yeah, no, I was.
As that's a whole discussion about all these stages.
Oh, I will have to listen to it. Do you want to ask a question?
Hi, Rabbi.
Yep.
Hi, I'm just I wanted to ask questions, but to my understanding and just clarify a couple things that all have to do with it. So you said 7 emanations of the name. Are those, and I have a lot of questions. This is the first question though. Are those attributed to the lower 7 attributes of the Sefirot, or the upper, or any attributes, or because there's 10, sometimes 11 attributes of the Sefirot?
The lower 7.
Okay, that's what I thought. Oh, hold on. Now my other question, not question, but you said, because we're talking about, or at least you guys were talking about there's so many things to unpack, and that's why I'm trying to say. So the 288 sparks are, how do I say
Listen,
it?
since we're going a little off with discussion, let me stop the record.
We were talking about the
Rabbi, I want to make an
on.
announcement for Rabbi. I want to make an announcement for the Hanukkah program, please.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So, due to the war, this is for everybody in this class and everybody listening. Due to the war in Israel, Rabbi Jacobson's organization, the Meaningful Life Center, has not done its usual annual fundraiser. The MLC is now conducting a limited fundraising campaign for Hanukkah to help support its programming, operating costs, and expansion of digital content to share with the world. Our Ayin Beis group is seeking to raise $1,800 to sponsor one night of Hanukkah for this program, in which the rabbi will give a vort to our Torah, a talk each night on a topic relating to the world's need for more light. please consider participating in this important program and revelation of light to help spread the words of Torah and Chassidus across the world. In considering this, please think about the priceless value you gain by learning through Rabbi Jacobson's programs, and please consider giving something back now. I'm going to post a link on the WhatsApp group Ayin Beis page. You can also find it at meaningfullife.com/sponsorships. And on the sponsorship page, there's a number of different buttons. You can click on 8 lights for 8 nights and enter the custom amount of your tzedakah. It's real simple, takes 30 seconds. Please think about this, and thank you very much. And a Freilich Chanukah to everybody.
Thank you very much. Yitzchak, let me just stop the recording, and when we can take any other questions. So I'm